based on the true story of James J. Braddock. That night at Madison Square Garden, Jim Braddock had just knocked out Tuffy Griffith in the second round. At the time, Jim was one of the toughest light heavyweight boxers around, and nobody had been able to beat him yet. The victory also marked his 10th straight win, giving both Jim and his manager another reason to celebrate. After leaving Madison Square Garden, Jim stopped to greet his fans and sign autographs before heading home and splitting the prize money with his manager. Back at home, May eagerly opened the door, hoping Jim had gotten paid that night. The moment she saw the smile on his face, she immediately hugged him in relief and happiness. Not long after that, their children came rushing over to greet their father, too. But 4 years later, everything had changed. The champion who once had everything was about to lose it all. This is Cinderella Man.
Cinderella Man.
By 1933, America was trapped in the middle of the Great Depression, and Jim was no exception. The once successful boxer had now fallen into poverty. One morning, Jim accidentally woke up his daughter Rosie, who immediately asked for food. May prepared a very simple breakfast, but it was obvious the family was struggling badly. Their finances kept getting worse, and they had already fallen behind on their gas and electricity bills for months. That night, Jim told May that he had another boxing match coming up. Win or lose, he would still get paid $50, and May was relieved to hear it. Unfortunately, there still was not enough food on the table for everyone. Rosie asked for more to eat, but May could not give her any because the remaining meat had to be saved for the other children. Seeing that, Jim quietly gave Rosie his own portion before leaving the house. With an empty stomach, Jim spent the day walking around the city looking for any kind of work that could help support his family. At one point, he joined a huge crowd of unemployed men hoping to get selected for jobs at the docks. Only 9 workers would be chosen that day, and sadly, Jim was not one of them. At the time, unemployment in America had already reached nearly 15 million people. When Jim finally returned home, Rosie ran up to him and revealed that her older brother Jay had stolen food. Jim immediately confronted him and told him to return the sausage he had taken. Jay finally admitted the real reason he stole it. He was terrified that he and his siblings would be sent away to live with relatives because their parents could no longer afford to feed them. Jim then reminded his son that being poor could never become an excuse to steal. No matter what happened, he promised he would never send his children away or separate the family. Hearing that, Jay broke down crying and hugged his father tightly. Soon, the night of the fight finally arrived. Before the match started, Joe tried motivating Jim and preparing him mentally. But while talking to him, Joe realized Jim's right hand injury had still not healed properly. He became upset that Jim had hidden it from him all this time. Still, Jim insisted on fighting because he desperately needed money for his family back home. In the end, Joe understood why he had no other choice. The fight finally began, but Jim entered the ring with an injured hand. From the start, he struggled badly. The crowd quickly became disappointed watching his performance because he could barely fight properly. Most of his punches came from his left hand, since his right hand was still badly damaged. At one point, Jim forced himself to throw a punch with his right hand, but it only made the injury even worse. The pain nearly caused him to lose his balance in the middle of the match. By the end of the 5th round, things were already looking terrible for him. During the break, Joe once again tried to motivate Jim while giving him as much advice as possible. Deep down, Joe knew Jim was in no condition to continue, and he even told him to stop the fight altogether. But Jim refused to quit. With only 1 round left in the 6th-round match, he pushed himself back into the ring anyway. Unfortunately, the result was exactly what everyone feared. Jim fought terribly that night, but Joe never stopped supporting him until the very end, when Jim was finally defeated. The audience looked disappointed, including the boxing promoters who had supported him before. Things only got worse afterward because the Boxing Commission decided to revoke Jim's fighting license completely. Jim tried asking for some understanding because he had been fighting through an injury, but the commission refused to listen. In the end, he was sent home with no money at all. Back at home, May was already waiting for him. Jim admitted that he had not earned anything that night. May was heartbroken after learning that Jim's right hand was now completely broken. Seeing how desperate their situation had become, May suggested sending the children to stay with her sister while she returned to sewing work until their finances improved again. But Jim refused. He insisted that no matter what happened, he would find a way to get a job and keep the family together. The next morning, Jim returned to the docks once again. Like always, huge crowds of unemployed men had already gathered there, all hoping to be chosen for work. That day, only 5 workers would be selected. Fortunately for Jim, he was finally picked. He immediately started working at the docks, carrying heavy cargo for long hours. It was there that he met a new friend named Mike Wilson. But even with the new job, life at home kept getting harder. One day, May found a man standing outside their house. He had come to shut off the electricity because the bills had gone unpaid for too long. May begged him not to do it, but there was nothing he could do since he was only following orders. From that moment on, the Braddock family had no electricity left in their home. They relied on candles to light the rooms at night and gathered scraps of wood just to keep themselves warm through the cold. One day, Jim's young son Howard became seriously sick, and it pushed May even deeper into despair. Their family was already drowning in problems, and now another hardship had arrived before the previous ones were even solved. After returning home from work, Jim was shocked to discover that the children had been sent away to stay with relatives because the house had become too cold for them to live in safely. Jim immediately became furious and heartbroken at the same time. He had promised his children that he would never let the family be separated, no matter how difficult life became. Feeling desperate, Jim went to an emergency relief office provided by the government, hoping he could borrow enough money to fix their situation. Unfortunately, the amount he received still was not enough to pay the overdue electricity bill. With no other choice left, Jim reluctantly returned to Madison Square Garden. Standing in front of the same people who once knew him as a successful boxer, Jim swallowed his pride and admitted how badly his family was struggling. He asked his former colleagues and friends for help. Thankfully, they listened. After humiliating himself and asking for support, Jim finally managed to gather enough money to restore the electricity in their home. Soon after that, the children were finally able to come back and live with their parents again. They were overjoyed when the lights turned back on inside the house. The next day, while Jim was spending time with his daughter Rosie, Joe suddenly arrived with unexpected news. Joe told him that he had managed to get Jim another boxing match. At first, Jim could barely believe it, but Joe assured him the opportunity was real. If Jim could defeat Corn Griffin, he would earn $250, and the Boxing Commission had agreed to give him permission for this one fight. Before long, the night of the match finally arrived. Backstage, Joe continued motivating Jim before the fight began. The fight was also being broadcast live on the radio, and the dock workers were stunned when they realized their co-worker Jim Braddock was the man stepping into the ring that night. Everyone gathered around to listen carefully. As soon as the fight started, Corn Griffin immediately pressured Jim and dominated the early moments. One heavy attack even sent Jim stumbling and nearly knocked him off balance. Still, Joe kept encouraging him from the corner. Slowly, Jim managed to recover and continue fighting. In the second round, he finally started landing solid punches on Griffin. From there, the momentum suddenly shifted. Jim completely turned the fight around. Round after round, he began dominating the match until he finally shocked everyone by defeating Corn Griffin. The entire arena exploded with cheers because nobody could believe what they had just witnessed. After the fight, even Joe admitted he was stunned by Jim's performance. Jim had entered the match as nothing more than a last-minute replacement, yet somehow he had just beaten one of the top fighters around. Reporters quickly surrounded him, taking photos and asking questions from every direction. But before leaving the arena, Jim and Joe briefly watched the main event of the night. There they witnessed the terrifying heavyweight champion, Max Baer, destroying his opponent with brutal force before claiming victory once again. At that moment, Jim unknowingly caught a glimpse of the dangerous future waiting for him. When Jim finally returned home, he was welcomed warmly by his wife and children. Everyone was overjoyed by his victory, and for the first time in a long while, the family could finally eat as much as they wanted that night. Even back at the docks, people could not stop talking about his fight. The workers and even the foreman praised Jim for what he had accomplished in the ring. Not long after that, Joe came to visit Jim with another important update. The Boxing Commission was planning to change its rules, which meant Jim could officially get his boxing license back. But there was one condition. Jim would have to quit his job at the docks and focus entirely on training again. When Jim told May about it, she was clearly uncomfortable with the idea. After everything they had been through, they had finally found some stability again. Jim now had steady work, and the family was surviving. May was terrified that the past would repeat itself, where Jim would lose boxing once again and end up unemployed all over again. Still, Jim managed to convince her that this was their chance to rebuild their lives. Eventually, May reluctantly gave him her blessing. But deep down, she still was not fully convinced. Without telling Jim, May secretly went to visit Joe herself. When Joe opened the door, she was shocked to discover that his apartment was almost completely empty. It turned out Joe had sold nearly everything he owned just to help pay for Jim's training and comeback. He had sacrificed his own comfort because he truly believed Jim still had a future in boxing. May was deeply moved after hearing that. Even Joe himself admitted that he did not fully understand why he believed in Jim so strongly, but somehow he just knew Jim deserved another chance. Meanwhile, Joe continued fighting behind the scenes to get Jim another match. At first, the boxing commission rejected the idea completely, but Joe refused to give up. Using every bit of charm and persuasion he had, he kept pushing until the commission finally agreed to give Jim another fight and officially restore his license. One day during training, Joe arrived with more good news. Jim would soon be stepping into the ring again. Joe promised that if Jim could win this next fight, more opportunities would follow. And if he kept winning, everything in their lives could finally change for the better. Soon after, Jim faced a fighter named Lewis in a brutal match. Despite the tough fight, Jim controlled most of the action and eventually secured another victory. Little by little, it started to feel like his comeback was becoming real. Then, on March 22, 1935, Jim stepped into another major fight against Lasky. This time, the challenge was far more brutal. Lasky pushed Jim to his limits and landed several devastating attacks during the match. At one point, he even broke Jim's rib. Not only that, but one powerful punch to the head sent Jim's mouthguard flying out completely. At that moment, Jim thought about his family, his wife, and his children, waiting for him back home. Instead of weakening him, the pain only made him fight even harder. Ignoring his injuries, Jim pushed through every round and gave everything he had for the sake of his family's survival. From that point on, he slowly began taking control of the fight. Heavy punches kept landing on Lasky, and the momentum completely shifted in Jim's favor. After 15 exhausting rounds, the match finally came to an end. Then the judges announced their decision. Jim Braddock had won. The entire crowd erupted with excitement and pride after witnessing his incredible comeback victory. Still carrying flowers from the celebration, Jim returned home to see May. But when he arrived, he noticed that Sarah, Mike Wilson's wife, was there waiting anxiously. She revealed that Mike had been missing for 3 days, and she no longer knew where else to ask for help. The moment Jim heard that his friend had disappeared, he immediately rushed out to search for him. His search eventually led him into the middle of a chaotic riot scene where people had just been violently scattered by mounted police. Jim desperately searched through the crowd while calling out Mike's name. Eventually, he finally found him. Mike was lying weakly on the ground, barely alive after the incident. Sadly, that would be the last time Jim ever saw his friend alive because Mike died that very day. Heartbroken, Jim later helped with Mike's funeral arrangements. As time passed, Jim's popularity continued growing rapidly. One day, May accompanied him to a large interview surrounded by reporters. By then, Jim had become one of the most talked about athletes in the country. During the interview, one reporter asked why Jim had chosen to repay the government relief money he once received during the Depression. Jim honestly explained that there had been a time when he desperately needed help, and the government had stepped in to support him. Now that his financial situation had improved, he felt it was only right to pay the money back. Then another question was directed toward May. The reporters brought up Jim's next opponent, Max Baer, and revealed that Baer had already killed 2 men inside the boxing ring. May was visibly shaken after hearing it. It turned out the rumors were true. Max Baer had built a terrifying reputation as one of the most dangerous heavyweight champions in the world. Later that night, Jim, May, and Joe went out together for dinner. Everything seemed relaxed at first until Max Baer himself unexpectedly arrived at the same restaurant. Jim approached him calmly, and the 2 fighters even spent some time talking and taking photographs together. But the atmosphere quickly changed. At some point, Max casually made disturbing comments about killing Jim during their upcoming fight. The remarks immediately angered Joe and nearly caused a fight right there in the restaurant. Back at home, May could no longer hide her fear. She stayed anxious constantly, terrified about what could happen to her husband inside the ring. Eventually, the stress overwhelmed her so badly that she snapped at the children while they were playing boxing games.
No boxing in the house! No boxing out of the house, all right? No boxing, period.
After sending them to bed, May confronted Jim directly. She was terrified that Max Baer would kill him the same way he had killed other fighters before. More than anything, she feared that her husband would never come home again. Meanwhile, during training, Rosie quietly pointed out something Joe already knew deep down. Jim was getting older. His body was breaking down, his rheumatism was getting worse, and his ribs had never fully healed after the brutal fight with Lasky. Facing Max Baer, the most feared heavyweight champion in the world, suddenly felt almost impossible. June 13, 1935 finally arrived, the day Jim Braddock would face Max Baer for the heavyweight championship. But despite everything, May still could not hide the fear in her face. Deep down, she never truly wanted Jim to take this fight. Even while sending him off, she could barely bring herself to speak. Before leaving, Jim looked at his family one last time and kissed each of them goodbye. Then he headed toward the arena. Along the way, people called out his name everywhere he went. Ordinary workers and struggling families had placed all their hopes on Jim. To them, he was more than just a boxer now. He represented people like them. Back at home, May told the children not to turn on the radio. After that, she went to church to pray for Jim's safety. But when she arrived, she discovered she was not alone. The church was already filled with people praying for Jim Braddock. His comeback story had become a symbol of hope during hard times, especially for the working class who saw themselves in him. Meanwhile, at the arena, Joe once again tried to motivate Jim before the fight. But just as Joe was preparing his gloves, someone knocked on the door. It was May. In the end, she could not stay away. May finally admitted that Jim would never win without her support, and now she too was placing her hopes on him. Jim gently told her to go back home and support him from there instead. But before leaving, May made Jim promise one thing. He had to come home alive, and Jim promised her that he would. Soon after that, both fighters were called into the arena. The stadium was completely packed with fans, while the match was broadcast live across the country through the radio. People at the docks and even inside the church listened nervously, all hoping Jim could somehow pull off the impossible. Back at home, May eventually discovered that the children had secretly turned on the radio to follow their father's fight. Seeing how desperate they were to hear what was happening, she finally allowed them to keep listening. Then the fight officially began. Right from the start, Jim and Max Baer traded heavy blows in a brutal battle. Only moments into the match, Baer targeted Jim's injured ribs with a powerful shot. It was obvious he already knew Jim's ribs had never fully healed. Luckily for Jim, the bell rang before Baer could continue attacking. As the fight went on, Baer kept punishing Jim's body while the crowd roared louder and louder. Round after round, both men continued fighting fiercely until the very end. Neither fighter managed to score a knockout. That meant the winner would be decided entirely by points. The entire arena waited anxiously for the judge's decision. Then finally, after what felt like forever, the result was announced. A new heavyweight champion had been crowned. By unanimous decision, Jim Braddock had defeated Max Baer. The crowd exploded with celebration and disbelief. Nobody could believe that the former unemployed dock worker had just defeated the most feared champion in the world. And with that incredible victory, Jim Braddock completed one of the greatest comeback stories in boxing history. The film then closes by showing several achievements Jim accomplished after that legendary fight. So the moral of the story is sometimes a father will quietly destroy his own body, pride, and dreams just to make sure his children never have to sleep hungry or feel abandoned.